a lot of what you're writing about, if you look at your land, yeah, it's the female spaces are very, very important. Yes.
Well, it's something to do, and this must come into. I haven't read the Quaker novel, but it must come into this business of a kind of highfalutin literary contempt for the domestic, and the domestic touches absolutely everybody, whether they like it or not. You cannot run ICI or a country or anything unless you have some kind of home life. Everybody does. If you don't get relationships right, you can't get anything right. And it is extraordinary how it's become a matter for disdain, to write about, as it were, the littleness of things. I think Virginia Woolf said it was a grave error to suppose that there was less significance in little things than in great things.
Although, if you think about it, John Updike also wrote domestic novels.
He did,
and
but
he was lauded and held up in high regard.
Well, he's a man.
Yeah, and
she said rather tiredly.
I know, and Ann Tyler is also lauded.
Yes,
also writes domestic, but I always felt that there's a slight condescension towards her that you don't get with Updike.
But sometimes it's good for people not to quite notice what you're up to, because you can get away with more. And then people notice that they won't try to stop you as much. Now, with A Balancing Act, a splendid book, you're looking, again, after I read it, I thought, what other books have I read that describe what you're describing there? And I can't think of any, but describe what it's about for us.
Well, it's a novel about a woman. I wanted to call it The Breadwinners, and I unfortunately gave in to the publisher's desire to call it Balancing Act, because I wanted it to be about a woman who was an exceptionally good businesswoman, who ran her own company in which her 3 adult daughters were all directors. And the effect this had on the men in their lives and on their domestic lives. And I did the research for the novel at the Emma Bridgewater factory in Stoke-on-Trent, because I thought I would do a rather sort of female business initially, something like the White Company, and then I thought I couldn't really faff about with scented candles for 3 years, and I wanted something altogether more robust. And pottery is, I don't know if anybody here is a Stokey. Is anybody here from Stoke-on-Trent? You are? Well, it's an enormous physical industry. And there's a tremendous gender divide within a factory about the men do all the casting and the women do all the decorating. It's all very carefully divided. I became completely hooked on the making of pots, I have to say. And also got to be Tristram Hunt's best friend, because we were constantly on the same train going up to Stoke-on-Trent. And I think it was the kind of book which, because it's about women and work, there aren't very many books about women and work. I've just finished one which will be published in about a year, which is actually, I did all the research in Canary Wharf. It's about women in finance. And women are extremely good at finance and are quietly at managing director level in all kinds of enormous companies. And are very nurturing, it seems to me, to the teams under them. That the kind of, my generation of bosses, I am a bit younger than Mrs. Thatcher, Lady Thatcher was, but not hugely. And they, of course, had to behave like a man because there were so few women around and it was expected of them. But it's got gentler as it's gone on. But I don't think there is another novel about women actually at the coalface of work and the effect this has on families, because of course it must.
Well, there are we might call extreme novels. There were the genre that we politely call sex and shopping, yes? from the 80s, but they're extreme.
But that's
they're not really about real life.
That's only about money. And when I did,
they're always running big companies, but you never see them at work.
No, exactly.
Yeah,
and
you see them doing everything else.
This is what it's like when you're actually working.
Yeah.
And do you know, when I updated, I was given this wonderful task of updating Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility, which she wrote in 1809, and I was bringing it up to 2013. And the novel was very young then, wasn't it? I mean, it's like it's as if we were writing in a genre that had really come to fruition about 1990. It's extraordinary that she understood that the great preoccupations of fiction were going to be class, money, and romantic love. And they have gone on like that forever. Because in fact, I mean, War and Peace is about that. 50 Shades certainly is. I mean, if it wasn't about money, 50 Shades would have been a novel about sexual abuse, wouldn't it? So, you know, it is very intriguing. You know, this business of graft is in at the heart of most things. And I'm always wanting to know, I sit in the underground thinking, what are you doing in the underground at 3:10 on a weekday afternoon? How can you afford to be here? How do you earn your living? You know, what are you doing?
I want to do that all the time. I want to go, not just in the underground, but definitely at Canary Wharf. Exactly how did you make your money? Yeah, I think we'd understand everything if we could just get everybody we walk past to answer that question, honestly.
Actually, when I'm driving at like 3 a.m. and there are other cars, I always want to stop and say, what are you doing here? Actually, 3 a.m, people are coming home from stuff, but at like 4:30 in the morning, you know that people have gotten up. Where are you going? I want to know. I wanted to ask you about Sense and Sensibility because the publisher asked me if I would do persuasion.
Yes.
And I thought about it, and I didn't have the spark. I really wanted to, but I think it's one of those things you either go, yes, I got it, or you can't labor it. You either say, yes, I can do it.
It was an awfully good ask, wasn't it,
yeah.
Tracy? You'd have been
Great,
brilliant.
I turned it down. Because I just couldn't figure out the way to modernize it. But I wanted to ask you about how did it feel to take a Jane Austen plot and make it your own?
Well, it was extremely interesting. The characters are absolutely timeless. They all translate to 2013 with no problem. You know, Willoughby becomes a Trustafarian with an Aston Martin instead of a horse. The Steele sisters were straight out of The Only Way is Essex. Marianne had that sense of emotional entitlement that is very prevalent among young women, you know, right now. And John Middleton, of course, is quite young. And there are only 2 characters in the entire novel she doesn't tease. One is Colonel Brandon and one is Eleanor. Everybody else she sends up.
Do you read...
She's absolutely ruthless. The problem was that, of course, in Sense and Sensibility, nobody works. Right. Nobody works because the great commodity of Jane Austen's youth was sugar. Not a million miles from slavery. Why does Mr. Bingley do the square root of F all? Because why is he going up and down from Netherfield to London in this idle manner? Because he is financed by sugar. And it would have been incredibly common. Why does Mr. Darcy, what was Pemberley built with? The proceeds of the coal mines of Derbyshire. What were the lives of 18th century miners like? Grisly. But it was so common in Jane Austen's day, she wouldn't have bothered to make anything much of it. So I did have to give people jobs. They did have to work for their livings. And that was the only thing that was at all jarring. Otherwise, everything else translated absolutely
but what's the thing that you discovered through taking a Sense and Sensibility to the present? What was the surprise? With the jobs, you had to build that into the mix. But
I think the surprise was that somebody who was working in what was a brand new literary genre was so unbelievably prescient about what would be the abiding themes of good popular, and I mean popular in the best sense, fiction.
Yeah.
See, See, I found when I was thinking about persuasion that I couldn't quite. What has changed immeasurably since her time is our attitude towards romance and relationships and money. We, people marry for love now, and they do, and that's the thing about persuasion. She does marry for love, but people don't even get married now. And actually, she does marry for love at the end, but only because he's wealthy. Wentworth comes back, and he's a self-made man, and she can defy her family and do it. But I just felt like I couldn't figure out a way to translate that into 21st century Western world, I guess.
There's also the question of the happy ending. I mean, you don't always do happy endings, or the happy endings aren't necessarily very happy. But that is a challenge or a constraint if you're updating.
Well, I think if you look at the last page of all the 6 great Jane Austen novels, you will see the moment she's got them to a resolution, the moment the proposal has been made, she's bored. She just says, well, I expect their marriage was, according to its lights, no better or worse than anyone else's. You're sort of on to the next thing. I think the energy has gone out of it for her. Mm-hmm. And after all, you have to remember that why the women in her novels sabotage each other so viciously is because marriage was a career for an educated woman. She was on the very cusp of making money when she died.
Yeah.
She was only 41. And so in the last 6 years of her life, she wrote the 6 novels we know her by. Mm.